Well, good afternoon. I'm Professor David Roches of the Near East South Asia Center at the National Defense University, and I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. Our topic today is maritime security in the Gulf and in the region around the Gulf, and we've assembled for you today a panel of experts that will speak to you on this issue from not just knowledge and authority, but also sincerity. You can find the first two easily. The last one's a little bit harder here in Washington. I will briefly introduce each speaker when they go on, but mostly I'm going to collate questions and field the questions. Please submit those in the chat function. We will collate them. I will reserve the right to condense and or make minor edits to some questions. I will do my best to convey your actual meaning and intent, but a lot of times we get duplicative questions, so please bear with me on that. This is an open discussion, so please ask accordingly. Let me give you a brief overview of the Gulf, and then we'll get into our first speaker. The Gulf, its importance cannot be overstated. There's a lot of popular narrative out here that some countries, most notably the United States, have lost interest in the Middle East. I dispute that, but that's a topic for another seminar. What we do know is that the economic and commercial interests are still there, and they're not changing. About 20 million barrels per day of petroleum and condensates pass the Strait of Hormuz, 4.2 million barrels per day of liquid natural gas to this. Can this be eliminated and bypassed? Well, theoretically, it can by pipelines. There are 3 pipelines from the Gulf that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Their maximum capacity is about 3.8 million barrels per day. So you've got 24.2 million barrels per day going by sea, and the capacity for 3.8 million barrels per day by pipeline. So obviously something has to happen. The importance of this cannot be understated. About 70% of China's oil comes from the Middle East and comes from the Gulf region, and that would be considered by them to be a national threat, a casus belli. People forget, but the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was precipitated by an American trade embargo on scrap metal and petroleum imports to Japan. So there is a possibility that should the production from the Gulf be interrupted, China might view things the same way. The United States recognizes this. There is a robust naval presence in the Gulf. Even now, a majority of the U.S. Navy's mine clearance assets are based in the Gulf. When I say a majority, what I mean is that there are more U.S. Navy mine clearance assets in the Gulf than there are in San Diego, Norfolk, Yokohama, and Europe combined. To examine these issues here, we have 4 distinguished speakers. The first will be my colleague at the National Defense University, Dr. Geoffrey Gresh. Dr. Gresh earned his PhD at the Fletcher School. He is a noted expert on things Middle East. His dissertation was made into a book that I think is mandatory reading for everybody. I'm proud to label him as a colleague. Geoffrey, you have 8 minutes. Have at it.
Thanks very much, Dave, for the kind and gracious introduction. Thanks as well to the colleagues. I look forward to the robust discussion that will follow on. So I've decided to kind of start and frame my kind of short remarks around the 3 main areas. So one of the kind of driving questions poses what's going on in general in the maritime security realm in the Gulf. So I'll look at 3 points. First is looking at kind of traditional sense of maritime security. The second is looking at supply chain diversity and kind of a push for growing independence in the space. And the third, which I think is emerging but increasingly important, is maritime cybersecurity. And that relates to ports, to shipping, to everything really, to the cable submarine networks that are so critical to just the larger global political economy. So first, traditional maritime security. I think in the last couple of years, certainly since 2019 and the several tanker attacks launched by Iran, also the tension growing between just this last summer between Iran and Israel, show that, indeed, as Dave points out there, that the Gulf, just from an energy security standpoint alone, is so critical and vital to just the larger global political economy, but also to the regional security. Now, certainly the dilemma and the challenge for most Gulf nations is they are very much tied into the U.S. military's larger regional and strategic presence. And it's true, one of my first books was looking at Gulf security from a U.S. military basing standpoint. And these bases have maintained large consistency over the past, X amount of years, and Bahrain and Qatar in particular being really important anchors for all the other countries because, as we know, they're small, generally speaking, very small navies with limited capacity. That being said, you see kind of in the last couple of years a push, especially in the likes for the UAE, for example, of trying to invest increasingly in unmanned platforms. And that, I think, is very much the future of investing in R&D, specifically looking at the UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles, or USVs, unmanned surface vehicles, as being the future of warfare. But on top of that, as we saw, one of the attacks, reportedly launched by a drone, showing and signifying how it's not necessarily going to be always a traditional type attack, but really some of these smaller stinging attacks that still have quite great significance. Now, in line with the, investing in platforms and the like, one of the things we've seen too is this kind of continued emphasis and placement on the importance of collective security. And that means, a Gulf nation performing exercise we saw right after the 2019 attacks, the U.S. coordinating and leading Operation Sentinel. We also saw the emergence of this international maritime security construct. The French, of course, got involved with their maritime surveillance mission, the creation of CTF headquarters in Bahrain. So clearly the continued thinking certainly is that there needs to be emphasis placed on the maritime security because of just the great energy security important place to the region. Now, one interesting element in all this, and I think it's still a kind of burgeoning topic, certainly in the maritime space, is the relationship to China. And we see, again, in 2019 being a big year, China and Saudi Arabia conducting joint naval exercises, but in juxtaposition right across, or in the Gulf of Oman, seeing that Iran, Russia, and China over the past several years conducting joint naval exercises. This is very significant. I've written many years ago, China actually has the potential to adopt potentially of recasting what we saw previously under the Nixon regime, but in a Chinese context of a twin pillar policy. Certainly we know the long and fraught relationship between the United States and Iran, but for China has a real potential, as Dave pointed out, just the reliance on energy alone, and also its very strategic, important relationship between Iran as well as Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries. So China down the road has the potential to be a perhaps intermediary to maybe stave off any increased escalation that might prevail. It remains to be seen, certainly, as we know, China doesn't want to necessarily get involved in domestic politics per se, but as it grows its investments and interest in the region, it can't stand back per se. Now, certainly the United States is still going to be front and center, and as we know, on the Gulf side, the Arabian Peninsula side, by certain estimates, there are around 50,000 U.S. troops spread, if you include Turkey and Jordan and the like, spread across the larger Middle East region, 50,000 troops, which is nothing to sneeze at. So clearly the United States has a vested and long-term interest, and this is going to play out significantly down the road. To the second point, supply chain diversity. We saw during the pandemic, and this we saw come more apparent during with the United States, of seeing about how to diversify our supply chains, not wanting to be beholden to one particular actor or country. Many of the Gulf states have really tried to push this. We've seen in Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, this push and this drive for wanting to have by 2030, 50% of all domestic expenditures in the defense, 50% of defense expenditures being tied to the domestic industry. Now, currently, there's a long way to go. By some estimates, it's only around 7.2%. And that was in 2019. By 2025, they want to hit the 25% mark, and thus leading to 2030. So certainly there's a long way to go, but I think there's increased thinking among certain Gulf states. And you saw in the realm of dual use technology, I should say, between the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia again, tying into US and UK military industrial firms of trying to tie in purchasing certain companies in some instances. So you're seeing a real push by the Gulf to say, hey, we want to not be as beholden in some realms of the defense industry, and we want to have greater kind of agency over controlling. You're seeing this even, the emergence in the case of the UAE, Al-Seer Industries developing these USVs, the unmanned surface vessels, now being able to then sell them to the likes of Saudi Arabia, being a very important, significant development and just the supply chain and independence. To the last point, and I'll end on this, maritime cybersecurity. Most people don't appreciate that we are connected the world over by approximately 200 submarine cables. 200. That's not very many. And those 200 cables account for an estimated 90+% of all communications. We know everybody relies upon the internet and security and the like. And if you run through, the entrance and exit points of each country, pretty noteworthy. If you look in Kuwait, for example, there's only one exit and entry in terms of being tied into the larger submarine cable. Iraq, one cable. Yemen actually has 4 entrance points. Saudi Arabia has 4 entrance points. So these entry and exit points that tie into the larger cable network communication system are very vulnerable, either physically, and we've seen certain cases over the past 20 years, either by accident. In one case, I think it was in Egypt or off the coast of the UAE, where it was actually a shark that cut through a cable. But you could also have a spoiler and actor who's able to penetrate the physical nature of the cable that would really cause significant instability and kind of potential disruption to certain systems. So I think down the line, a lot of these countries will need to focus increasingly on the port element, the cybersecurity specifically. Now, if we throw China back into the elements, it's really interesting to see that in 2017, and they've been on the hunt very similar to what we saw with the British and the laying of the all-red cable in the 1920s that connected all the outlying empires around the world through telegraph cable system. The Chinese are in the process of doing something very similar through the Siwimi, which is the Southeast Asia, Middle East, Western Europe cable. But we also see in the Asia, Africa, Europe 1 cable that runs from France and Italy through the Suez Canal, connecting to Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Oman, going to the UAE, etc., off to Karachi, Pakistan, over to India and off into Southeast Asia. Now, it's a conglomeration of many different companies. It's very much done in the international business sense, but it shows again that the Chinese understand that power is very much tied and nested in information and communication structures. Everything that we do is tied to these submarine networks, and so securing them in the future and preventing against cyber attacks. We saw, just this past summer, I believe the Israelis launched a cyber attack against one of the ports in Iran, actually, as a result of the ongoing tit for tat between the two being very significant and important. So with that, I'll end it, and I look forward to the follow-on discussion.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Our next speaker is Bilal Saab. Bilal is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He is also a former senior advisor in the Pentagon, but don't hold that against him, who oversaw all security cooperation programs in the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility. And I'm proud to call him a friend. Bilal, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. And thank you for your friendship and mentorship all these years, Dave. And I also want to thank the Gulf International Forum for the invitation. So I think we've all gotten the memo by now. There isn't a more important and pressing priority for for the United States in foreign policy than competing with China, right? This is something that Jeff just mentioned. And I think we may have different ideas about how to, pursue this competition. And I'd even say in the U.S. government itself, there is some uncertainty regarding the best strategies and tools for execution. But there is one trend that is unmistakable regarding policy execution that shows a clear movement of U.S. military resources from the Middle East into the Indo-Pacific. And you may not like or agree with this approach, but you can't deny that it's happening. And even more so, I'm not sure it will stop or be reversed given the strong political consensus behind it. Now, in the few weeks or months ahead, you will see this shift of U.S. military resources codified or formalized in the Defense Department's Global Force Posture Review. Itself, of course, it's going to be informed by the administration's National Defense Strategy, which I would guess is going to retain some of the core principles of the NDS of the previous administration and focus on great power competition. Now, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Mike Gilday, is himself still unclear, what the administration will want to do with the Navy and what its investments are going to be, what it's going to buy, and how it's going to prepare for this new great power competition environment. But like I said, answers should be coming up soon in those two documents, and those will have certainly implications for the Middle East. The posture review itself will, I think, even the unclassified version will have some specifics on what the Navy should expect to provide to all the combatant commanders, right? Now that the fleet is freed from this enormous priority of supporting ground wars in the Middle East. You remember that the Navy, for the bulk of the past 2 decades, had a constant 1 to 2 aircraft carrier presence, so 1.5 average, in the Fifth Fleet AOR, which certainly has strained the service. Now, it doesn't take much to see that this transfer of military resources from one region to another, it's not theoretical, it's real. Let me give you a couple examples. So we've removed 8 Patriot batteries from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, just over the past 4 months, even though the Saudis, as you very well know, are still facing a considerable missile threat from Yemen. Jet fighter squadrons also are being reduced. Now, I'm not saying that all those weapon systems are going to necessarily go to the Indo-Pacific, but what the bottom line is, and what matters, is that they're actually being taken out of the Middle East, right? And then you got the military training missions. Some of them are actually being trimmed, cut, for example, in Jordan. The U.S. National Guard Infantry Battalion that was assigned to the Jordanian border guards had to be moved. So you roughly have now like 50 U.S. Marines who have to take on that responsibility. And I expect that trend to escalate over the next few months and years, which hopefully will encourage, if not force, regional partners to step up and make further investments in indigenous military capabilities to defend themselves against various threats. Now, the one domain where we have yet to see important changes in our posture is the maritime domain. It's those waters in the Gulf, for all the reasons that Dave, you have mentioned in your introduction on the critical significance still of that area. As we hold this very conversation, the headquarters of the naval component of CENTCOM, that's NAVCENT, are still in Bahrain. Okay, now who knows, that might change. But right now, as we speak, the NAVCENT commander is still in his office, performing his duties and directing the Fifth Fleet, among other duties that he has. For many years, and well before this whole talk of great power competition, the U.S. Navy, more than any other service, has sought to push for a more collective security framework in the Gulf, anticipating that one day will come when they will be asked to draw down and deploy in other priority regions. And this effort has been done patiently, gradually, and I would say a lot of good has come out of it. Jeff has mentioned Operation Sentinel. So that was initiated in July of 2019. And that's not the only effort, but it's the latest effort to try to police those waters in a multilateral framework. Jeff also mentioned CMF, the Combined Maritime Forces. So 17 years prior to Sentinel, we had and still have the Combined Maritime Forces, which, if my math is correct, include 33 like-minded countries. Voluntary basis, none of that is mandatory. No sea control or power projection mandates, but still some good stuff coming out of it. And we've obviously led this effort, but what's really cool about CMF is that our own contributions have demonstrably decreased over the years, with some Gulf partners, and I'm going to specifically mention the Kuwaitis and the Saudis, picking up the slack. I mean, the Kuwaitis themselves, you got to hand it to them. Over the past few years, they have now 5 times commanded CTF 152, which focuses on illicit non-state actors and counter-piracy. Sentinel, the nice thing about it, it was supposed to be complementary to CMF, right? And if you remember at the time, it was focused on deterring Iranian aggression, even though we never called it that way, but we all knew that that was exactly why we stood it up. We maintain a persistent presence in the area with cruisers, frigates, destroyers, robust command and control suites, secure communications and data links, some rotary wing aircraft capabilities. Then, of course, you have the smaller patrol craft and the corvettes patrol between them. Here's the problem with Sentinel. It was never clear what the rules of engagement were. And you would think something like this that is so incredibly important would be clearer, but it wasn't. And the whole notion of collective self-defense also wasn't clear. Questions like who's doing what, when, and why are we doing this? All these questions pretty much dogged Operation Sentinel right from the beginning. So if I'm out at sea, right, and I'm patrolling, and I perceive a threat, or worse, I'm actually under attack, am I supposed to coordinate with others? What kind of support should I expect? No clear answers to those questions. As promising as the progress that's been made, as I just mentioned, in terms of including those Gulf partners in maritime security, the reality is, and Dave, you emphasized that these are blunt, sincere conversations we should be having. So here you go. The reality is the United States, if we are to significantly draw down in those areas, and let's see what the Global Posture Review is going to say and what the NAS is going to say, our Gulf partners will be in no position to fill that void. Not even the British, who are back to Manama, as you very well know, not even the French, who have a presence in the UAE, will be able to fill that void. Those 2 NATO members are not capable of generating the same force structure that we are capable of generating. So let's be very blunt. The Gulf partners don't really have navies. I mean, those are essentially coast guards with no real punch, no considerable firepower. Why? Because they've never bothered to seriously invest in naval capabilities. They've always relied on us to do the heavy lifting and handle all major contingencies, including Iranian aggression. And if you ask me, it's always been a risky proposition because their national security, I would say existentially, they rely on their ability to export and sell their oil to the international economy. So you would think that they would make a little bit more of serious investments in the maritime domain than they have thus far. Don't get me wrong, we do care about freedom of commerce and navigation in that part of the world, once again, for all the reasons that you mentioned, Dave. But those resources that we're putting to bear are not the same anymore. We are energy independent. I would, as a matter of fact, let me emphasize very clearly that we are not energy independent. We are energy sufficient. So we are still committed to that part of the world. All those choke points are extremely critical to the international economy. But our psychology and our mindset regarding energy sufficiency certainly has affected and influenced our thinking in terms of how many resources should we actually deploy in that part of the world to secure that area. Let me conclude by saying the following. We'll keep doing what we're doing, and we'll keep pushing as long as we have those resources. We'll keep pushing those partners to link up those maritime assets that they have, at least so they can share intelligence more effectively, so they can have some kind of a common maritime picture and better maritime domain awareness. But it's the exact same problem I see in maritime security that I see in missile defense, which Dave, you and others know very well, it's really less about the amount of hardware, amount of technical equipment that is so critical. It's more about the politics, and it's also about the trust among those countries. I'm very pleased to see the Qataris back into the fold, with relations improved with the Saudis and the Emiratis and others. But are we at a stage now where they can actually discuss collective security measures in that part of the world and actually cooperate on security and on sensitive topics? I'm just going to leave that as an open question for now.
All right. Well, thank you, Bilal. I got to tell you, preach to the rafters, brother. You've heard me say this many times, but one of the things that just amazes me is, given their maritime dependence, why have the Gulf states not become the global center of excellence in naval countermine warfare? It just astounds me, and you can still find attacks using technology that hasn't varied a whole lot from World War I. Floating mines with contact probes, chemical contact probes. I have a picture taken with a mine that was made in Tsarist Russia on the grounds of the Kuwaiti Staff Academy, and that creates the same amount of difficulties for commercial shipping as a technologically advanced mine. So we'll get into that in the questions. That's enough of my editorializing. Well, now our next speaker, a fellow graduate of King's College London, the most elite educational institution in the world, and a fellow at the European Council for Foreign Research in Berlin. Her mic is currently muted, but she will unmute it shortly. And Dr. Cinzia Bianco, we've collaborated in the past, but you're here to give us a European perspective on Gulf security. So Cinzia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. It's always a real pleasure to be in these chats with you. And thank you to the Gulf International Forum for inviting me, and to my colleagues who have given excellent introductions in terms of what is it that we're facing. And actually, let me pause for 1 minute and go back to what has just been said, because I think that it's, particularly from a European perspective, what resonates, and it's not going to be good news to you, is that what I've heard so far has not really given me any sense whatsoever that the United States is as committed as it was to maritime security in the Gulf, or that it regards that as a top priority or security interest or national security interest as it did in the past. And I think that, this is really what we've been discussing for in the recent past in Europe, in different contexts and in different discussions. What the Europeans are trying to understand is what is the level of commitment of the United States to in a number of theaters and to a number of security challenges. And you've mentioned all the reasons why maritime security in the Gulf in particular is still important. But at the same time, you've also mentioned that these reasons are not as strong as they used to be. And from the European point of view, it kind of feels in the same way. So, of course, European countries, and we will include the United Kingdom and just speak of European countries, not just European Union countries. Their trade flows with the Gulf is extremely significant. Their energy trade with the Gulf is not that significant. So it's mostly about the role that the Gulf plays in terms of its own geopolitics and its own position, geographical position, at the heart of connectivity between Asia, Africa, and Europe. That's the real value from a European point of view. And that's why the maritime security in the Gulf is important. So it's, I think, very relevant to make that distinction and explain why maritime security in the Gulf is important to Europeans, because when we understand that it's mostly about connectivity, we've mentioned trade, but also submarine cables, of course, are absolutely crucial. And in general connectivity, then we can draw a line to which areas exactly in the Gulf or around the Arabian Peninsula are important and or vital to European interests. And of course, it's not going to be the upper edge of the Strait of Hormuz, where, the territorial waters of Kuwait, for instance. It's mostly going to be the outer edges of it, the Arabian Sea and off the coast of Yemen and Oman, Bab el-Mandab, so on the other side, and the Red Sea in particular. And I think, it's important to make that clarification, because I see a growing desire to really be specific and be consistent and be concrete with the strategy that European powers can put in place, including in maritime security in that area of the world. So it's already been mentioned, the European mission in awareness, in the maritime awareness mission in the Strait of Hormuz, that is led by France, but also includes 8 other European Union countries in its political track, and also a few other European countries in its military track. And the French have basically been making the argument, the same argument that we're making here, that there are certain areas in particular in the maritime space of the Arabian Peninsula that are vital to European interests, and that they're not as vital to the United States any longer, and that local players, so Gulf countries, are not yet at the stage where they can take care of their own security. Also, they don't want to. We've heard the Saudis again and again, but also the Emiratis and many other, basically all of the Gulf players are saying that this, in their view, is a global, is an area of global interest, and therefore should be an area of global responsibility. It is a rhetorical device to say that they don't think that they should be solely responsible for maritime security in what is a strategic area for global players. So that is the argument behind the inception of EMASOH, the European mission, which was initially led by France. And it's a gradual process. First of all, it's a gradual process to get the attention of Europeans to that area of the world. We know that for decades, the Europeans have been much more focused on the Mediterranean space, and so the North Africa and Levant sub-area of the wider Middle Eastern area. And then second is to step up their direct involvement and engagement in very gradual processes. So until now, EMASOH, the mission, only takes care of basically looking after European ships and vessels and tankers. But there is an ambition to expand that. First of all, there are more member states that are committing assets. We're expecting from one day to another a formal decision by Italy on the specifics of how many assets they will be sending to cooperate with EMASOH and to take active part in EMASOH. But also the scope of the mission, I think, will be up for discussion. And I think there is a window to do that under the French presidency of the Council of the European Union, which is coming up very soon. So, and that is, from a European point of view. I want to use my final 1-2 minutes to link up to another dimension of maritime security and cooperation in the maritime space, which is important from a European point of view, which is the port politics that is being deployed by several GCC countries. I'm talking specifically about the UAE. The UAE has been at the forefront globally of efforts to create a network, a very strong network, and disseminated and diffused around the world of ports that can be linked together in what is they have called string of ports or string of pearls, using conglomerates such as DP World, Dubai Ports World. They are now in a leading position. For instance, in the Red Sea, they're absolutely the leading player, and they're able to link up using only infrastructures where they have a direct presence, the ports of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but mostly Dubai, to the south of Yemen, Socotra, where they do have an important presence, and then up in the Red Sea, on the shores of the Horn of Africa, through the Suez Canal, and in Egypt and Libya, where also they have a foothold, and southern Cyprus, where also there's been a decades-long deal signed with the terminal in Limassol. So this is, if you draw sort of connect the dots, it shapes up to be a specific strategy where I think we can say that the UAE is trying to get ready to position themselves as a partner of choice, almost an indispensable partner for other global players that are looking at connectivity as a way to expand their geopolitical influence. And of course, here I'm talking about China and the Belt and Road Initiative. As a matter of fact, the UAE is today, in some areas of the world, in particular the Red Sea, already an indispensable partner for China if China wants to really get the strategic depth that it will need to execute its Belt and Road Initiative. The one question that remains opened up is specifically a question about the security of these maritime assets and infrastructures. DP World and the UAE are fantastically efficient at developing that network, but how can they secure infrastructures that are located in very unstable countries or regions of the world, including, for instance, in the Horn of Africa? They definitely don't have the capability to do that on their own. They, of course, have a number of options. They can resort to private professional forces that can help secure these infrastructures. They can rely on the local partners, on the local armed and security forces in the host country, or they could rely on other global partners, such as the Chinese, and align to what they are doing and they intend to do to protect their own assets. This is an open question, but I think it's going to become very, very central to understand the limitations and possibilities of port politics in the Gulf. The other Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia is to a certain extent interested in this strategy. The UAE is doing, to a certain extent, exploring possibilities. Other countries like Oman and Kuwait and Bahrain, they're not in the same position to be that ambitious. And then we have Qatar, which is interestingly seems to be left quite behind on this in this particular realm of strategy and interests, but could become suddenly more interested and try to catch up to the strategy. So these questions about the security of this connectivity are going to become quite central for all of these GCC countries, really. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Cinzia. So now we slide into the question and answer period of this, and this is really where it gets interesting, I hope. Please, if you're in the audience, feel free to submit your questions via chat, and then, as I said, I'll do my best to convey the accurate, honest, and succinct meaning of them. Let me abuse the privilege of the chair, because what's the point of having a privilege if you can't abuse it? And ask about the evolving EU mission. So I guess I'll give this to Cinzia. So when EMASOH was stood up, it was stood up at the same time as Operation Sentinel, which was the US-led one. At the time, this was widely portrayed, rightly or wrongly, in the United States as basically Europe recognizing the importance of maritime security, but not wanting to be too closely linked with what they saw as a possible Donald Trump initiative to attack Iran. Donald Trump is no longer president. Presumably the interests of the United States and Europe remain the same, yet EMASOH, this duplicative mission, arguably, still remains in place. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Joseph Biden acting more Trumpish than Trump with the unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then the supplanting of the French in their role as providers of submarines to Australia. So do you see an abiding future for a potentially duplicative maritime mission for Europe, or is this something that will eventually be reconciled and unified with presumably some scale of economy, or economy scale?
That's an excellent question. And I can tell you
Of
that
course it's excellent. I'm the chair.
Yes, you are. That's an excellent question, and it is so good that European policymakers have been asking the same question, just in reverse. I mean, our colleague Bilal said that Operation Sentinel was probably not planned in all details, and that gave some question marks in terms of what is the future of that operation itself. I'm not saying that it could be disbanded. Of course, all things are possible, but could it undergo some change in terms of have definition of the rules of engagement? I mean, so far there's just too much lack of clarity to really take it to the next step and talk about merging the two missions. Also, there's a number of other question marks, which is, for instance, that Operation Sentinel, of course, also includes other players. It's not only the United States and the United Kingdom. It is, local players. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are formally part of that mission. And there's nothing, wrong with having a multilateral mission that includes indigenous forces. Of course, it's much welcome. But that was not the purpose of EMASOH, because the purpose of EMASOH was in two ways. The first one was, the surveillance part, which is actually called Agenor. And then EMASOH was the diplomatic track. And it is supposed to be, very slowly and very gradually, painfully slowly, to be a platform to discuss maritime security between the two sides of the Gulf. So to also provide for a space where the Europeans can facilitate discussions and agreements at the technical level between the Iranians and the GCC countries. So you can't have any of these players being formal members of this mission, because that would, neutralize the purpose of making it a neutral space for facilitation. So I think that all things are possible, and they definitely the missions can be merged in a way and blended together in a new form for even, but there's still too much lack of clarity, and there would be some hard points to discuss.
Okay, we'll give you some breathing room. That was a good answer. Dr. Gresh, the next question is for you. The Chinese have never shown much appetite for getting committed militarily beyond their self-defined near abroad, which seems to be expanding a little bit. Do you believe this reluctance is changing? And if so, how? It's a little bit outside of the topic, but I think it comports a bit with your research. So I throw this to you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I recently put another book out, To Rule Eurasia's Ways, the New Great Power Competition at Sea. And as part of that research, I had the opportunity to go to Djibouti, for example. And as we know, one of the kind of triggering events for the Chinese is much further north and west in Libya. That when Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011, there was something like 36,000 Chinese nationals living in Libya. And the case had to be, how do you extract all those people? You can't do it via planes. So the Chinese were very much caught flat-footed, and they had to actually reach out to the Greek government to get ships to then put the foreign nationals. Similar, closer back to the Gulf, happened in Yemen as well. Not in the same amount of numbers. I think it was probably closer to 600, maybe 1,000. The Indians actually had more foreign nationals living and working in Yemen. So it's all to say, and this is where it gets at this kind of fascinating dynamic between security and economic interests. Now, currently, as we know, all of the Chinese state-run corporations have invested. But now when you're dealing with countries that are insecure, you have to be able to defend those interests. So I think it's true that China has indeed been very reluctant, or as one of its core foreign policy pillars, we don't get involved in domestic politics. But I think their hand is increasingly being forced. And I think at one level there is opportunity. At the same time, there's a reason why there's real concern as they become more integrated or more invested or more proactive in certain Gulf countries, because that then challenges directly U.S. interest and U.S. involvement. But I think the change is already happening significantly. I mean, Cinzia mentioned all the port, dynamics at play. I mean, this is a real thing. Seeing China invest in all these ports very smartly from a business standpoint, right? They invest 40% in a port, and then over the next couple of years, they then take an additional 11% investment in that particular port, and they then own a majority share. And so this, kind of slow creeping push to the west, if you will, has become a real dynamic that is forcing China's hand, even though it doesn't want to be directly involved. It's going to ultimately have to be more directly involved.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question for Bilal. How would the U.S. disengagement from the Gulf change the GCC states' approaches and willingness to initiate and cooperate with maritime security for the Gulf? For instance, if the U.S. made its intentions clear to take a step back from the Gulf, how would the GCC states respond to and address the security risks and tensions in the Gulf? Might argue with the precept of the question, but
yeah, I mean, let's start with the precept. I don't think that the word disengagement really is something that's on our agenda. I think we're only really talking about here, hopefully, what would be a balanced, reasonable, measured reallocation of resources. The good news about this whole thing is that if you're just describing the threat that we're facing here, which let's just look at the higher end of it, which is Iranian aggression, right? So I'm not talking about the piracy, which used to be more manageable, now has grown, I understand, but it's still manageable. I'm talking about Iranian aggression. Even that, if you draw down a little bit, you're still able to meet it, right? So the whole premise of things are going to fall apart if we were to draw down is erroneous, right? Because we still have dominance in that part of the world. I think there's plenty of room for us to reconsider our posture in ways that would still meet the objective of security and our core interests in that part of the world, but also pay closer attention to this new global priority that is China. I would hope, and I have every confidence that people in the administration are looking at it that way, that the best way to actually compete with the Chinese is not just in the Indo-Pacific. For all the reasons that we're mentioning here, is that in the one area where they are so dependent on, which you mentioned that percentage, 70% of their oil, right, is dependent on the Middle East. You want to establish a presence in that part of the world still. You cannot leave that for the Chinese to exploit, because you're actually hurting yourself in the very theory that you just described as a priority, which is the Indo-Pacific. So great power competition happens on a global stage. You don't want to create all of a sudden a vulnerability in the Gulf and shoot yourself in the foot just so you can have more resources to play with in the Indo-Pacific. That's what's so difficult about this whole notion of great power competition, which I hope will have a little bit better of a definition moving forward, and hopefully in the NDS, because it happens on a global stage. And you got to have a little bit better metrics of how you actually define victory and how do you actually define this competition. So I don't see disengagement as an option. I don't think we're that stupid. But at the same time, it's a tricky balance for us, because even the slightest movement of resources from the Gulf to the Indo-Pacific is going to cause all sorts of anxieties in the Gulf. And we always have to balance between reassurance and meeting security threats. And that balance is never easy, because that trust that we have has eroded over time. And it's not just happening in the maritime space, as you very well know, Dave, it's also happening in the missile defense space. The fall 2019 attack against Aramco is something that people still have nightmares over in the Gulf. And so this trend of unreliability that is in the minds of Gulf leaders has now transcended from the ground level to the aerial space and now to maritime security. So any movement that we conduct of resources from this region to the Indo-Pacific is going to cause a lot of anxieties and fears in that part of the world. But what are their options, just so I don't miss your question? Not good, okay? They're not good. I just mentioned to you, because this is not going to be something that they're going to be able to do within a week or two as far as further investments in maritime capabilities. That conversation should have started a long time ago, because frankly, they should have known that we're not as, dependent on, as far as energy, at least consumption of that part of the world as we were before. But, some of them are starting this process, but boy, is it going to take more than a week. So options are not great as far as indigenous military capabilities. But, the hope is that they would, hedge their bets, I guess, or rely a little bit more on the French and the British. But even that option is not great because of the reasons that I mentioned to you before. They don't have the same capabilities. They don't have the same willingness to actually get in a fight with the Iranians should that contingency materialize as we do.
Yeah, good point. One of the things that I wish there were transparent accounting of is how much of the U.S. military capability in the Gulf is to defend the Gulf versus how much of it is there because they're good hosts.
Thank you very much.
There to support operations in Iraq and
Yep.
Afghanistan.
Right.
And I remember after the retrograde from Iraq in 2011, I spoke at a conference right after Prince Turki Al Faisal, who did a barn burner where he said, you guys have left us, all these troops are gone. And I was not too far removed from the Pentagon at the time. And I was like, all those troops we withdrew, they had nothing to do with the Gulf. They were there because that was the cheapest and easiest place for us to station them. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific, maybe we'll build a naval base in Australia, but we don't have it yet. If we're going to position forces there, our bases are in the Gulf. So it'll be interesting to see. Cinzia, this kind of builds on your remarks about the EU, extrapolates it outward. Should there be a UN-led body formed by the Security Council that guarantees the safety of maritime traffic in the Gulf? Mm-hmm. A short question with a long history.
Yeah. I will, just give that answer, moving that towards another argument that has been made often these days, which is that the UN should be a facilitator or a guarantor of a new regional security architecture in the Gulf that would, serve as the foundation for different relations between the GCC countries, Iraq and Iran. And for the same reason, I don't think it's a good idea. I think that, first of all, the United Nations is not, they're literally, that's not their job. Their job is to, coordinate among nations, to serve a place to coordinate among nations, and then to really be at the forefront of conflict resolution, even conflict prevention, is, only when the local actors have that sort of request should the UN be present on the front lines. And then the UN, especially the Security Council, it includes all of the great powers. It includes the US, it includes Russia, it includes China. So to think that, the Security Council should be responsible for maritime security or for a regional security architecture in the Gulf is to say that the great powers should agree among themselves about this balance in the regional security, which I think is going to be extremely difficult because that's just not the way they're thinking. They're thinking in terms of balancing one another out, not of coordinating and create some form of shared strategy for a regional security architecture or maritime security in the Gulf. So I think that's just incompatible with the reality of politics, that it's going to be more and more about great power rivalry.
Dave, I don't want to sound like Stalin, but how many frigates and destroyers does the UN have? Okay.
Well, I since you threw in Stalin, MacArthur received the surrender of the Japanese on the USS Missouri, which was flying the United Nations flag. People forget, but Japan did not surrender to the United States. They surrendered to the United Nations. But the Missouri is now a museum exhibit. So yeah, you win that one. Geoffrey, Omar El Jalfi asks, how do you address the UAE being involved in Aden port? Only happens when I'm talking on the computer. Being involved in Aden port and their relations with the Southern Transitional Council. So I think they're asking you to describe the interaction between these commercial and security interests in ports with their support for the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen.
Yeah, so I think, in general, Yemen as a larger conflict has been a failure, but also a great humanitarian tragedy. And, sadly, I think Yemen sits at kind of the frontier. I've been doing other research on another book looking at Ottoman sea power. And even the Ottomans faced real difficulty and challenges. And of course, the United States, we did during the Cold War with ties to Nasser, et cetera. So it's all to say that Yemen sadly sits at kind of frontier politics of various regional and great powers. And I think, the ultimate hope is that Yemen can indeed, and I get, we don't have enough time to discuss, you get its own panel and much longer discussion about what you do in Yemen. But I think the long and short is we've seen certainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE excursion and support into Yemen has not worked, and certainly the Biden administration signaling that this is not going to be a priority, and in fact, we want to come to some sort of resolution. So I think certainly there's going to be interest in the case of the UAE and Saudi Arabia or Oman for that matter, because it's right on the borders. But ultimately, I think there needs to be a political solution so that we can go after Al Qaeda and other illicit elements.
Okay, thank you. Bilal, you have a question from Jane Kinnamont, who is formidable in her own right, and also a graduate of the School of Middle and African Studies, which is perhaps the only institution in London better than King's College London. She says, Bilal, you speculated the U.S. naval presence in Bahrain could potentially change. Is there a live discussion about this, as there was after the 2011 uprising, or not really?
Oh, I'm not privy to those conversations, obviously. However, I really suspect that there's not going to be major movement out of Bahrain. I think that what the Bahrainis offer in terms of access is just simply irreplaceable. And I don't have any political equities in Manama. I just happen to know what we have in terms of the Fifth Fleet and everything else that we have in there. Since I've visited the base several times, I've had multiple conversations with former commanders there of the CMF and the Fifth Fleet. It's just extremely difficult to replicate what we have in Manama and other places. And there have been conversations about it, heck, even conversation about moving some of that stuff to sea, but we still do not have the capacity to operate at sea like many pundits have suggested several years ago. So for now, we're staying in Bahrain until we have a better option. But of course, you always got to have contingencies, right? I mean, nobody expected what was going to happen in Manama in 2011 or in other places in the world. And so you got to have a plan B, right? And I'm sure there is one, but we're not going to exercise it anytime soon because we just don't have ready answers for the impeccable access that we got from the Bahrainis.
Yeah, good point.
Unconditional, by the way, rapid, effective, constant, and in a era of post-Benghazi political environment where we need immediate intervention should shit happen, right? You get that from the Bahrainis more than anybody else in the Gulf, including the UAE, by the way. We still need the permission to move our men from one place to another because every emirate has its own laws and what have you. Same thing with Qatar, same place with Oman. It's just in Bahrain we're almost guaranteed that we can do anything we want without the permission of the Bahraini government.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the low points of my career, I was trying to make in a clever way to emphasize this, but I started off by saying, there's not a lot of shipping thing. A very senior Bahraini official didn't get the point I was making, thought I was de-emphasizing it. People really misunderstand the nature of our maritime presence in Bahrain. When you hear the phrase naval base, you think there's an enclosed basin with gravening docks and dry docks. But what's really important about it is the quality of life installation, the fact that there's a high school there, an American Department of Defense high school, which the Crown Prince of Bahrain has graduated from, and which has produced more Arab graduates than I think we have Fulbright scholars. So it's the one place in the Gulf that you can send people with their families, deployed units with their families. The tactical installations are perhaps, they're critical. but they're not as important as that. I mean, you can have a guy on a career track, and he will not regard a deployment to Bahrain as a family disruption activity, the way it would be if you were at El Dhafra Air Base or on El Udeid. So, yeah, good point.
4 years ago, Dave, I wrote an article about the possibility of relocating the Fifth Fleet. I think it's in the American interest. So I would.
You called me about it.
That's right. So I would urge anybody who's interested in this topic just to at least have a better understanding, objective understanding of the tactical operational difficulties of moving the fleet somewhere else beyond the political stuff. So just that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a gem, but the key thing is American families living. I mean, advocates of soft power. Bahrain is the best. You know, we actually have families. You know, children and spouses in close proximity with Bahrainis on a daily basis.
Yep.
Okay, from Ziryab Jamal, this will go to. I'm going to give this to Cinzano, to Cinzia. I'm sorry. Obviously, I'm thirsty. What is the operative difference between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Ethiopia? And I'm sorry, it's a little Horn of Africa, but perhaps you can broaden this out to the region there. But with regards to their military engagements, such that the latter is sanctioned while the former two are not. So why is Ethiopia, which is involved in a particularly nasty war, being sanctioned or excluded by organizations such as the European Union, while Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have their own unpleasantness going on in Yemen, are not?
Yeah, that's not entirely accurate, because there is, the Europeans can sanction you from left and right at so many different levels that in the end you really cannot say whether a player is sanctioned, is not sanctioned. So you have the European Parliament sanctions, you have the EAS sanctions, you have European Commission's broader sanctions. You can have specific sanctions under the European Commission that are only managed, by the DG Energy or DG Trade. And then you have individual member states of the European Union, and they have their own sanction regime. So it's not entirely accurate. The Saudis and the Emiratis, they're both being under an arms embargo from a number of different European countries for several years. There's been several diplomatic crises between, for instance, Germany and Saudi Arabia, because there was a sanctionatory regime that was too broad for the Saudi taste. Italy has placed a full embargo against both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. It's now softening the conditions of the embargo against the UAE, but it's still formally in place. So it's much more complicated than that. I think there is, of course, this is also why it's so difficult to define a specific, clear and simple European position on issues and vis-a-vis countries. Because what most people don't understand is that the Europeans never aim for clear, simple, and unique. They aim for nuances. They want to be specific. They want to be able to say, perhaps this person or this ministry or this institution is under sanctions and under this specific type of sanctions because of this specific activity and for this specific amount of time. So what they aim for is always nuances, and that of course muddles the picture, and people do not, and they have good reasons to complain. Of course, they have very good reasons to complain that the outcome is that there is never a very clear and very easy to explain position.
That's about as succinct a statement of the differences between us as I could imagine. You all are too young for this, but I recall during the 2006 presidential campaign, John Kerry was derided for enhancing, for actually using the phrase nuance. And that was felt to be that, and there were also people who criticized him for looking French. Those were seen as negative electorals. We're running out of time. I'm going to give the final question to Dr. Gresh because it comports most closely with his research. Can Saudi ports on the Red Sea, like Yanbu, and Oman's Salalah port or Duqm, when that comes online. Be stronger alternatives for the export of oil to escape the risk coming from Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. It's a simple question, but it's fundamental to what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it gets like any economic investment portfolio, diversity of sources, diversity of how you're getting out your oil and gas. You can't go wrong. Obviously, it's very expensive, but I think, as we all know, the Strait of Hormuz is going to remain as a critical choke point. So if you can avoid it, great. That's gonna be a good investment strategy.
Yeah, and I've heard rumblings from some of my friends that the Saudis are looking to actually build a pipeline across the Rub al Khali to bypass all the straits and go straight onto the Indian Ocean. But again, capacity is limited. And if we go back to the old days, the days of the tap line and other such things, perhaps if the Abraham Accords have some life in them, the possibilities of pipelines directly to the Mediterranean would, of course, be the answer to a lot of problems. Well, we've got 5 minutes to go. Normally, this is the point where I summarize, but I think I've spoken enough. So let me ask each of the participants if they've got something they want to say, emphasize, or criticize the other panelists for in a minute, and then we'll call it a day. So let's start with you, Bilal.
Frankly, I want to thank you, Dave, for moderating this. I think it's an incredibly important conversation. I don't think it, gets a lot of attention, frankly, or sufficient attention. I've learned a lot from both of my colleagues. I'm not really technically an expert on maritime security. I just focus on it from a broader perspective in terms of regional security. But the difficulty with these things, as always, is really less the tactical operational issue. It's much more the political stuff, right? And the policy divergences that exist within the regional countries themselves, but also between us and them. And then trying to manage, of course, how do you bring into the fold the Europeans, specifically the French and the British? There's a ton of firepower in there. There's a ton of goodwill. It's just all about really organizing it and managing it in an environment that is just so uncertain policy-wise, and especially now with 2 major documents of ours that we're working on that are going to give us a little bit more clarity about our posture moving forward and how many resources we retain in that part of the world.
Dr. Gresh.
We haven't talked much about the Abraham Accords. I think that indeed is going to be one that's fascinating to watch. And to your point, I think it's a good one about when I was doing research for the last book, I was in Haifa, and the Israelis were kind of, it was aspirational, certainly, but I think that's a real concern. And even for the Chinese, too, trying to bypass the Suez Canal, which we've not talked about, there's real interest. And so it remains to be seen. But I think even initially between the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, there's already been important technology transfers that could be a benefit in the maritime space.
Dr. Bianco.
Yeah, thank you. Also, I wanted to thank you for very interesting comments. What I want to do is emphasize something that Geoffrey said when he spoke about undersea cables, because I think we don't fully realize how much the digital infrastructure might become the pipelines of the future. So we, in our field, we have been discussing about the geopolitics of pipelines and energy exports for so long that I think probably sometimes we are a little bit blind to what is the future of these sort of geopolitical questions, and the future might be undersea cables, which means that although I fully agree that in terms of energy export, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal, that was a very good point, it's going to remain extremely high on the agenda. Is there really a way that you can do the same with undersea cables? Like if you look at 12 different undersea cables pass underneath the Red Sea and through Bab el-Mandeb. And I mean, this is quite, the Suez Canal is the world's largest single point of failure for underwater internet cables. So That's quite scary in there and a potential threat in the making.
Yeah, good point. I mean, we focus on the transit. We neglect the physical infrastructure. There's this idea that somehow everything goes up into the ether, that it'll all be done with satellites. Well, in the time to remain, let me make two quick points that are often neglected. One is rail. We haven't spoken a lot about rail. It's neglected, and it's neglected because it is seen as national, not intranational. But I would point out that, like a large country that produces petroleum and exports it, like Canada, still moves a lot of its petroleum products by rail. And if there could be a capacity, not just for the break bulk material and food and stuff coming from Gulf ports and things, so imports would be enhanced by rail, but also even exports of petroleum. And then the second thing, for those who look at American security and force deployments, we tend to focus on equipment. I would just urge you all to look at the fact, to recognize that the United States has an all-volunteer military, and recognize the fact that when we send a Patriot battery on an emergency basis to Saudi Arabia, for example, what that means is that, the sergeant first class who, say, has a child who's starting 6th grade and has just gotten back from tours, he's now told, you're going to be away from your family for a year. And keeping that kind of presence out there, and we can't just move soldiers from a supply unit to a Patriot battery. You have to train them. Maintaining soldiers under that is hard, and we tend to overlook that. Well, those are just food for thought. I want to thank the audience for the questions. I thought they were really good. They played to the strengths of our speakers today and provoked further discussion. I want to thank the conference organizers for bringing together such a group. I thought this was great. But above all, I want to thank the speakers for providing illumination without heat, for providing thought without conflict, and addressing difficult issues in a collegial manner. So thank you for that. Thank you for checking in. And with that, I wish you all a good day.
Thanks very much.